Okay, great. It's my great pleasure to introduce Sally Hurst, who has come all the way to us from Macquarie University in Australia. We've been working together for a couple of years now, and Sally has set up the amazing Found a Fossil project, which you're going to talk a little bit about today.
Yep.
We have worked together on excavating dinosaur trackways and all sorts of other things. And Sally has really interesting experience that crosses archaeology and paleontology. So without any more from me, I'm going to hand you over to Sally.
Cool, thank you. So, as Brian mentioned, my background is both in paleontology and archaeology. In Australia, a lot of the time the things you might find in the landscape could be either one. We certainly don't have as much material archaeology in terms of buildings that you guys have here, but we have a lot more stone artefacts and tools, and a lot longer time scales as well. So Aboriginal Australians have been living in Australia for about 60,000 years, so much older than the ancient Egyptians and everything out here, but very different kinds of culture. Very different in significance and their preservation to fossils, but they're both things that are found across the landscape, often by non-scientists, so farmers, miners, bushwalkers. But there's not a lot known on what to actually do if you find something, and so for me this led to my research asking people about what would you do if you found something. And so my research at the moment is comparing responses in places like Australia to other locations around the world. And some of the funding that Brian and I got is now comparing Australia to Alberta in Canada, where we all go digging, and to England as well. So for anyone who doesn't know who I am, I'm a researcher at Macquarie University. My background is also in science communication, so I'm an educator at the Australian Museum. And I also run my own business doing talks at schools, for conferences, on TV and radio. And yes, also love going digging in the field with Brian, as well as at some of the Australian locations I'll show you in a little bit. And all of that is under the umbrella of the Found a Fossil project. So this basically came about when you're thinking, what would someone Google if they found a fossil and they had no idea what to do? Found a fossil is a pretty easy keyword for them to search. So today I'm going to give you a bit of a breakdown on some Australian fossil legislation, how that relates to the Found a Fossil project, how that relates then to, or is different quite significantly to the fossil legislation that we have in Alberta, and the role of museums in that country. I'll talk about a few of the experiences I've had in relation to UK fossils and legislation here. I'm by no means an expert, so very willing to learn. Are you worried about those pings that are coming up?
I'm just going to move this thing out of the way.
All good. Yeah, and then talk about some of the current research that Brian and I are doing in this space. Can she not hear?
Can't hear. Yeah. Okay.
Do I need to go closer over there, or?
No, she said she hears sound but not voices.
Right. So.
Yes. So very strange. I just
Continue. Okay, let me. Okay. So has anyone actually been to Australia? Few people. Do any of you know any Australian fossils? Yeah?
Ediacaran.
Yeah, the Ediacaran ones? Yeah, so super old.
It starts from Dinosaur Cove, so the early Cretaceous. Was it mid-Cretaceous?
Yeah, early to mid-Cretaceous down in southern Victoria. Anyone else?
The marsupials.
Yes, we have a lot of weird marsupials. But generally Australian fossils are not very well known, not only by you guys, but also by the Australian population. A lot of the time, if I say, can you name an Australian dinosaur? They'll kind of go, is T-Rex one? And definitely have to say that no, we had nothing like that in our country. So some of the more familiar ones, or first to give you a bit of context of how big Australia is. You guys are about half the size of New South Wales, which is the state where I am from, so you are teeny tiny. Yet you've got more than double the population that we have, so you guys are really crammed in here. Most of our population is also centred around the coast, so there's very few people who actually live anywhere in that middle chunk, and most of it is desert. So there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of fossil sites that we just haven't discovered yet, because no one is out there looking. One of the fossils that you might be quite familiar with, you have several of these in your museums here. Does anyone know what it is?
It's a Dryptodon, isn't it?
Yep, Diprotodon.
Giant. It's related to wombats, isn't it?
Exactly. So wombats in Australia, they kind of look like bears, I guess, but they're about this big. Whereas Diprotodon was the largest marsupial to ever live. It was about the size of a car. Had a backwards facing pouch, and they lived at the same time as Aboriginal people in Australia for many thousands of years. So they actually have some oral stories that suggest it was less like a gentle and curious elephant and more like a temperamental rhinoceros. So we have yet to find any definitive evidence that these guys were hunted by humans. We've never found cut marks on bones. However, they are that big and maybe that grumpy that you wouldn't want to hunt them because they might turn around and charge you. The wombats we have nowadays are quite notorious for if you get too close they will charge you. They've got very strong little heads. And they can be quite violent towards other animals as well. So wombats nowadays are burrowing creatures and they have an entire back plate of cartilage. So if a fox or something is running after them into their burrow, they will actually lower themselves and smash that back plate into the head of the fox and crush its skull across the top of the burrow. So they're pretty hardcore animals, and so again, they're quite small. If you needed to, you could just step over one. Not quite so for these guys, so this is to give you a bit of scale as to how massive they were. We also have some amazing sites from the Miocene. So this one is about 15 million years ago, and it has incredible soft tissue preservation. This one was discovered, or the site was discovered by a farmer on his property after he accidentally drove over it in his ute, and then he stopped because he thought he had a flat tire, and kind of jumped out and was like, oh, look at all these cool fossils. So he called the Australian Museum. They went out on an expedition and have found hundreds of incredible fossils. Before this site was found, Australia had a total of 4 fossil spiders that we ever found across the whole fossil record. This site had 13 new species. The sawfly that you see on the right-hand side as well, it's quite incredible. It has the wing venation you can still see. But if you put its little face under a microscope, you can see the pollen preserved on its cheeks. So it was possibly pollinating a flower just before it died. So very cool, we can see these ecosystem interactions in these fossils as well. You mentioned the Ediacaran fossils. So in South Australia, we have the Flinders Ranges. And this is where we get evidence for some of the oldest life forms on Earth. So if you've ever heard or seen of the geological golden spikes, that are used to say this is where we define the Triassic or the Cretaceous. The Ediacaran one is out in the middle of nowhere in these hills. And these are the kind of fossils that we are looking for. So the archaeocyaths on the left are these weird little underwater corally things, but even smaller are, so this is from the scanning electron microscope, these tiny little microscopic features called small shelly fossils. I'm glad someone cares, honestly. This is what my supervisor studies and they're very cool, but when you've got this versus dinosaurs, I don't know, for me it's an easy choice, but I'm glad someone lets us know about them. Now, this is quite close to Dinosaur Cove in Victoria. This is the Twin Reefs site down in Victoria where I was digging earlier this year. It's not a bad office to have to go looking for fossils. And in Australia, a lot of our dinosaurs are quite small ornithopods, so little herbivores running around on 2 legs. This one is of a specimen called the Ankylosaura, and it was named after the daughter of the paleontologist who found it. Turns out she also had a son called Tim, so to make sure little Tim didn't feel left out, she went and found another dinosaur and called it the Timimus. But this one had a weirdly long tail proportionate to its body. And so the representations of it say that it could be a little signal. These dinosaurs were living in the polar circle at the time. We found at other sites preserved dinosaur feathers, just the feathers, not the dinosaurs, so don't know how they correlate that. But it leads to some very interesting imaginations of what these dinosaurs might have looked like. We can go a little bit further north up to Winton, and the dinosaur digs start to look very, very different. Back up here, they have what we call this kind of self-mulching soil. So through huge floods and then droughts, the bones kind of get churned up in this soil, and occasionally you'll get one that remains on the surface. And then if you dig below it, you'll hopefully find more bones from the same dinosaur. So up in Winton, we find lots of sauropods. We think they were from on the edge of an inland sea or even a swamp, and so we often find their legs because they got stuck in the mud. So the rest of their body hasn't always survived, but the legs and the feet are often still there. And as you can see, it's some pretty heavy machinery that we get to use to dig them up, so not quite the toothbrushes that we might be used to. Queensland is where many of our Cretaceous fossils come from. So we had an enormous creature called Kronosaurus, which one of the original specimens was taken back over here. We have dinosaur trackways, and this specimen is probably the best preserved dinosaur that we have in Australia. This is Cumbarosaurus, who was a little ankylosaur, but he was only about this big. So he's about knee height, he's very, very small, so nothing like the ankylosaurs from overseas and even here that were pretty enormous. And the last site I'll tell you about is Lightning Ridge. Has anyone heard of Lightning Ridge before? Yes, a few have. Do you know why the fossils here are so famous? No. So Lightning Ridge is a little bit like the Wild Wild West. It is in the middle of nowhere. It's probably about 8 hours west of Sydney, but you're still in New South Wales. So again, that's kind of how big our states are. All of these little holes are individual mine shafts. They're only about 1 metre square each. They go about 18 metres under the ground to where the fossils or where the gemstones lie. A lot of these mining shafts are on larger farming properties, and so they lease from the farmer. And so because it is private property, there's not actually any need for your vehicles to be roadworthy. Hence the sign that you will see at some intersections, cars with brakes, please give way. Otherwise you just kind of hope they roll to a stop. But Lightning Ridge is very famous because it is the only place on Earth you can find opalized dinosaur fossils. You can find a few other places on Earth where you can find other freshwater bivalves and plant fossils that are opalized, but Lightning Ridge is unique that it has vertebrates and it has dinosaurs as well. We do have a little regional museum up there called the Australian Opal Centre, who does run digs for the public, so if you do ever want to go. And this is also how I originally met Dr. Phil Bell, who comes with us to Canada. I went on one of these public digs for a few days, and a lot of it's sorting through the tailings that the miners have discarded. But Phil saw how keen I was, so he was like, "You're not my student, but do you want to come down into the mines for a few days?" So we did that. We were looking for more dinosaur bones, and we think we found some. And then he invited me to Canada. So, this is one of the most spectacular specimens from Lightning Ridge. Does anyone know what it is? It's probably about 3 centimetres across. It's quite small. Yeah. This is the jawbone of an ornithopod dinosaur. So these little weird leaf-shaped things are the teeth. So opal mining in Australia, it's a very rough and tumble process. Generally you use jackhammers or underground diggers in the mines to get the stuff out of the wall. Hopefully you'll find a big enough piece of opal that you can just pluck it out and see it. Other times you'll wheelbarrow it into a bucket, which then goes up a hoist, so up that 18-metre ladder, gets dumped into a truck. That then goes into a modified cement mixer. So they call it an agitator, and it's basically a giant rock tumbler. So they chuck all of the dirt in there with a bunch of water for several days, and round it all goes, hopefully breaks up the clay and disintegrates it. And so then when you wash it at the other end, known as a tail out, it's very easy to see if there are any other chunks of opal. And they might be tiny, but there's a very active artisan market of these incredibly talented jewellers in Lightning Ridge. So you've got the very rough and tough miners, then you've got these quite refined jewellers. Sometimes they're the same people. But yeah, so this had gone through the agitator. It had gone to various miners just in a bag of rough opal. No one had recognised it. It eventually made its way to South Australia, so several thousand kilometres away, where an opal dealer was going through this bag. No one had wanted to buy it, and he picked out this tiny little jawbone fragment. And in the same bag, he's going through the rest of it, he actually found a connecting piece. They'd managed to stay together throughout this whole process, and again, it's about this big. There's about 2 or 3 dinosaur species that have been named from Lightning Ridge, and this is one of them. So it's a pretty incredible find that it's lasted. And so these are some of the examples of these dinosaurs from around Australia. They all have fantastically weird names. But all of these, as well as 70% of all Australian dinosaurs, were not found by scientists. They were found by miners, by graziers, sheep farmers, and so all of these are examples of that, and these 3 are also named after the person who discovered them. And so protecting fossils in general, it's not just up to us academics and us scientists, because half the time we're not the ones who are finding them, we're not the ones who are out there on the ground. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the time what you might find, it could be a fossil, it could also be an Aboriginal artefact. So my research looks at what people would do in both situations if they found either one of these, and what legislation applies in both cases. So when we take a look at the legislation that's actually out there, it looks like a lot, but for fossils especially, if it exists at all, it's incredibly vague, it's very outdated, and fossils are never awarded any specific protections themselves. So in New South Wales, for example, where I'm from, National Parks and Wildlife Act, if it's in a national park, it's protected along with dirt and leaves and everything else that you might find in a national park. Unfortunately, also in New South Wales, all Aboriginal cultural heritage is also protected under the National Parks and Wildlife Act of 1974. So it's still quite racist acts are in place across the country. And again, a lot of these things, they're very hard to enforce. It's very hard to get anyone prosecuted if they do destroy something accidentally or on purpose. And so a lot of the time the legislation, it's not actually doing much to protect this material. To give you another example, so in Queensland you can apply for a fossicking licence. Fossicking is basically our term for fossil collecting or mineral collecting, looking for gemstones and things. So there are some designated fossicking areas you can go to, but it says that you are not allowed to collect any vertebrate fossils. But it doesn't actually say what you are meant to do. If you do find a vertebrate fossil, sure, you leave it there, but who am I meant to call if I've just dug up a new dinosaur? There are a few regional museums out in the outback that were actually started by farmers because they were like, we don't want to send it to Brisbane, thousands of kilometres away, where we're never going to see the fossil again. So they've actually tried to keep a lot of their specimens where people, local people, can see them who have discovered them. And in New South Wales as well, speaking of places like Lightning Ridge, it's not in a national park. Again, a lot of it's on private land, so if you dig up a dinosaur in your backyard, you can do whatever you want with it. There's no requirement to report it, there's no requirement to keep it intact, and so a lot of the miners, if they find a dinosaur and it's opalized, they will make a lot more money by breaking it up into chunks and selling it as opal for those jewellers, rather than keeping it together as a scientific specimen. A lot of our museums, similar case here, we have no money. We would love to pay the miners for their fossils, but we just don't have the funds to do so. And this is their livelihood. They don't get food on the table unless they sell opal. So it's a very delicate balance between what is scientifically significant that we'd like to keep, but also how do we keep our communities alive and thriving. Now, in Australia, we haven't really had any research on this topic. A lot of the time academics are very good about talking to other academics, but we don't always include all of the stakeholders in the research itself. And so this is what my master's set out to do. So I designed an Australia-wide survey that asked many people, what would you do if you found something? Really just creating a baseline for what are the problems, where are the gaps, what are people doing, and so later we can try to address those. So because I wasn't as interested in hearing just from my network and scientists and paleontologists, I wanted to hear from the farmer down the road, or my hairdresser, or anyone who might be hiking and getting out there and who could potentially find something. So I did radio interviews all across the country. I did road trips to many of the regional museums. I did talks at different locations and contacted as many local newsletters for miners, farming magazines, and government departments as well, just to try and make the survey as public as possible, and so we could have a really diverse response. And so I had people from all over the country reply. Most of these people do align with the main population centres around Australia. It's one or two right in the middle of nowhere. But it ended up being over 1,300 people who replied. So if you've ever stood outside a shopping mall and tried to get people to sign a petition, you understand how annoying that can be and how hard it can get to get people to engage. So this was a really positive response to get. And when we answered that question, if you found a fossil, would you tell anyone? Over 70% of people said, yes, I would, which is really positive. But when we started asking people, who would you report things to? This is where it started to get a bit interesting. So most people would report things to a museum. Again, this is exactly what we want. Hopefully that museum has the resources and the staff to actually identify or verify those finds and go and research them if it is something interesting. But when we compare this response to Aboriginal artefacts, we can see, again, it seems very obvious. Go to your local Indigenous community. Who better could advise on the heritage of an area than the people who have lived there for thousands of years? But enter colonialism. Under state heritage law, you have to contact your state government. And so about 90% of people actually got this response wrong. Now, leading on from that, when we asked people what would stop you from reporting a heritage find, for fossils the main answer was, might not be significant. If it's just a rock, I don't want to waste someone's time. But for artefacts, it was, I do not know who to contact. And so in Australia, Aboriginal archaeology and heritage is much better protected under legislation. It has a lot more protections. There's departments or teams in every single state and territory, or at least one guy whose job is to create websites and resources for people to answer the phone if they say they found something. But even with all of those resources, more people are saying, I don't know who to contact about Aboriginal archaeology compared to fossils. So even if we did change legislation, even if we did bump it up, even if we did have these departments, doesn't necessarily mean that will equate to better protections for fossils. One of the other results I'll share is that I asked people to agree or disagree to the statement, I feel confident that existing laws in my state adequately protect fossils and sites. Adequate's a pretty low bar, but we had 30% of people who disagreed, saying, I don't think it's adequate, it's not protecting it. But we had a massive amount of people who just said, I don't know. Lots of people in the survey said, I assume these laws exist, but very few could actually provide details on what that legislation might look like. We assume it should be protected because it's fossil heritage or cultural heritage, but it's obviously not being communicated very well. And so for that 47%, how can we communicate this better? So as part of the survey, there was an optional section where you could read or watch a video, a brochure, a social media post, and you could provide feedback on how engaging and interesting it was, what you found helpful. And at the very beginning of that survey, we asked people, would you report a fossil, yes or no? And then for anyone who selected no, we asked the question again after having watched or read one of these formats. And about 50% of people actually changed their minds. So for fossils and artefacts, this equates to over 120 people. And so that could be 100 future fossil finds that are now protected into the future. Now this was an 8-minute anonymous survey. I had a budget of about $400, which went towards getting an animator to create the video, but the rest of it was just self-funded. So if I can have that rate of change in an 8-minute survey, I would love to see what a government-funded or museum-funded awareness campaign could do in this space. And as I mentioned, I didn't want to just leave people hanging about what you should actually do. And so Found a Fossil is also a website platform which provides guidelines and a breakdown of the legislation in each state and territory on what to do if you actually find something, both for fossils and for Indigenous finds, and really just trying to myth bust some of the fears that people have about reporting, and just making this information much more accessible. They don't have to go to multiple government websites or museum websites. It's all here in a centralised platform. And one of the quite fun things that happened from creating this website is that many people of the public now think I have the expertise to identify the things that they find. So I've gotten some very interesting things sent to me, and the best one I've been sent is this. Certainly looks suggestive. And the person who found it thought it was a part of a dinosaur. 3 guesses what part. And just in case it was actually something, he's pretty sure it was a rock, but just in case, I'll send it in. Now unfortunately it is a rock, it is a concretion, but I think I can speak for the room. We would be very, very excited if it was this particular part of a dinosaur. We've never found one before. We found a cloaca, but we've never found any other dinosaur genitals. So while this one may not be the find we were hoping for, we need people to have this curiosity and this want to engage with us. And so when the next one does pop up, we can work together to figure out what it could be. A big part of what I do as well is not just doing research, but going out and talking to the public as much as possible. So a lot of this is talking to school kids, so the next generation of paleontologists. But I also, as I mentioned, do lots of radio and TV interviews. I go and speak at conferences and different events, all about how we can protect fossils into the future and how this isn't just the job of us scientists, but it's the job of everyone in the community. So I want to change tacks a bit and now look for Alberta, Canada. So you guys, I definitely know you guys have been to Alberta, Canada. Do you guys know what the legislation says about finding fossils if you're a member of the public?
I know that you can't take them out of the state.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's about $50,000.
Yeah. Yeah, so Alberta has some of the toughest fossil laws in the entire world. So when we are there in Dinosaur Provincial Park, so in southern Alberta. It's a gorgeous place. And we are there as part of the undergraduate field school that Brian runs. What is that?
How did you do that?
No idea. It wasn't me. Magic. But we're there with scientific licenses from the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, so we're quite lucky we get to go to the places that the public doesn't get to go. Some of the sites we get to look at, most of you will probably be aware, this is the Kasky hadrosaur that Brian found with Nell and Terry. Little dinosaur sticking out of the wall with some incredible skin preserved as well. And we're still excavating it, so hopefully it will come out this year. But this is what it looked like in 2023 on the left compared to when we left in 2024. So they've knocked down a lot of rock to get to this dinosaur, and hopefully it will now fit inside the museum. So Canada has made, or Alberta specifically, has made it very easy to figure out what to do if you actually find something. They have a single piece of legislation under the Historical Resources Act. You're exactly right, Steph, it's about 50,000 Canadian dollars if you violate any of these laws. And that can include fossil poaching, so going into the scientific reserves and taking something. It can involve excavating it. So if you find something on the surface, that's okay. You can be the custodian of that fossil, but legally all fossils still belong to the Crown, which is basically the government or the museum. And yeah, if you try and take it out of the province as well, you'll be fined very heavily. So you guys and us in Australia, we have many Canadian specimens, but lots of these were agreed upon loans or trades, and so most dinosaurs around the world have stuff from Dinosaur Provincial Park because they've got so much of it. But it means that whether you are a member of the public and you stumble across something, it's very easy to know, yeah, I'll just ring up the museum, I think I've found something. Whether it's scientifically significant or not, they can take a look at it. It also goes for the really big mining companies that are out there. Alberta is very well known for oil, and those big miners are moving a lot of dirt and they'll often come across some really special specimens. But half the time they're quite excited when they find something. They like being part of the discovery of something new. So one of the incredible specimens that they have in the museum there is this ankylosaur. It has stomach contents, it has scales and skin preservation. It is beautiful, and this was found by one of those big mining companies. So again, it's not just the scientists who need to be protecting this material, it's everyone in the community. And I'll finish up now by talking about some of the experiences that I've had with UK legislation. So I've been here for about a week and a half now. I've got another 2 weeks to go. But my dipping my toe into UK legislation actually happened a number of years ago during one of my science communication lessons with the public. So I do something called Skype a Scientist, and it's where you get matched with a classroom somewhere around the world. And you have keywords associated with your topic, so mine are fossils, dinosaurs and Egyptians. So I get lots of hits, often from both topics, which makes it very confusing about archaeology versus paleontology. But there's this little school in London who I've got to do lessons with for about the past 5 years. And so anytime I do one of these talks, whether it's Pakistan or Singapore or Canada or London, I try and match, these are the kind of fossils you guys might find. And so there's a great website here called the UK Fossil Network, and it has guides on different locations you can go fossil hunting in the UK. It often provides links to the local codes of conduct if they exist, but there's not a lot of information on here about what the legislation actually says. That might be because it's a bit like Australia, that it's there but no one really knows about it, or it's not enforced, or maybe it applies but no one really knows, so it's just kind of left out. But there's also forums on here where the public can submit their finds for identification, and so there's a pretty good network and infrastructure already here that I feel could be adapted to something like the Found a Fossil project, having that legislation made quite accessible, because this is the first thing that pops up when you Google, I found a fossil, what should I do in the UK? So it's a good resource to have. Over the past week or two, I've also been able to visit many museums, but not a single one that I could obviously see had a sign about what to do if you find a fossil. This isn't unusual, the Australian museums are the same, but for us, I would say it's a bit different because, one, our fossil sites are usually in the middle of bloody nowhere. You're not just going to stumble across them. We have such a smaller population that there is no fossil trade in Australia, or if there is, it's very small. We don't have enough fossil sites for this to be a sustainable source of income. And again, most of them are on private property as well, so local people can't just go and collect stuff to sell it. Sarah and I went to Lyme Regis last week. We went on a fossil walk with one of the locals and it was spectacular. They have so much knowledge, and he is a collector on the side as well as doing these educational walks. He had worked in the Lyme Regis Museum for many years before kind of becoming a sole business owner. And it was amazing to see how many fossils you guys have here and how the trade actually functions, and how there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the museums and scientists and academics and the fossil collectors on the ground. That's just not something, a dynamic that we have in Australia or really Canada. The Lyme Regis Museum does have their collector's code within their museum, so it was very good to see that. And the Charmouth Heritage Centre, which is just across the beach, does have their own little fossil collecting code, which you can look at the images, or there's a more comprehensive one for the commercial sellers as well. And again, this is just not something that we necessarily have need for in Australia, but it's good that these are being implemented here. There is also a little fossil registration that you can do. So if, again, a member of the public or one of these serious commercial sellers does find an incredible piece or something special, they can register it. This will then go out to academics and paleontologists, and they can kind of say, I'd like to contact this person, I'd like to see the piece. But again, this is happening on a very localised level. And the Charmouth Heritage Centre, it's free entry. They rely, it's charity, exclusively on donations. And so having the staff to do the identifications, to coordinate these responses, takes a lot. And so just a few of the things I noticed about the UK. Again, there's not a lot of direct connection between the public and paleontologists. The National Museum, like Australia, it's not integrated into the legislation or into the fossil reporting system like it is in Canada, so maybe that would be something to look at in future. The Royal Tyrrell Museum, the rules in Canada, they're very strict, but they work. They do have occasional issues with fossil poaching, but they're also very quick and reactive. So when we were there in 2024, they were telling us that there was a person who was wandering around the scientific reserve, and whether he had fossils on his person or not is ambiguous, but theoretically he wasn't supposed to be in that spot because it's reserved for scientists and he didn't have a permit. But that wasn't actually, that rule wasn't written anywhere, it was more of a guideline. And so the Royal Tyrrell Museum worked with the Alberta government to create an executive ministerial order, and so within 2 months they had a new protection on that park that actually said, no, you can't go into this section. So that's the quickest I've ever seen legislation change or move, but it was quite good to see that that can happen if needed. And yes, lastly is that, again, I've already discussed that the legislation is often not enforced, but the fossil trade here is so interesting to me because we just have nothing like it in Australia, and it introduces a whole new set of stakeholders that you really need to balance their needs for. I think the closest example we have is the miners in Lightning Ridge and having to balance their livelihoods with scientific specimens, but I think it's on a much larger scale over here. And so the research that I'm doing right now, the reason that I was able to come to the UK was that I'm doing a survey of people who work in paleontology. So whether you are a student in zoology or studying conservation, if you are an academic or teacher, if you are a lab technician at the Royal Tyrrell Museum or you work for Natural England, it's open to a very wide range of people. And so we can start to hear perceptions on how often you might actually talk to the public about this, or non-academics. How often does your museum promote or communicate this information about fossil protections, and should they be doing more? And so when I was looking at the different locations that we chose, the first thing was that they had to have recent fossil discoveries, including some made by non-scientists or non-academics. They had to have a government-funded museum somewhere in the state or country, So he does have the Natural History Museum, but also has many smaller interpretive centres or regional museums, because I think if the government funded one is not doing its job, these guys can often help to pick up the slack, and a lot of the time they have more face-to-face time with the public or with the non-academics and fossil collectors to actually make real change on the ground. And so this research is looking at both Queensland and New South Wales in Australia, Alberta and now England as well. So I have a link to the survey that I'll show you in a bit, so you're all more than welcome to take the survey, and I'd love to know what your thoughts were. And so yeah, we're asking questions about, should museums be doing more? Do we actually want the legislation to change, or is it more about raising awareness of what is currently in place and just making more people aware of it? And sometimes that can be enough of a deterrent for people to know, oh, that is against the law, I'm not going to do that thing. And in the comparison, how can we take the best features of all three localities? So if we did want to change legislation, or if we did want to create a broader framework for how to protect fossils, what does best practice actually look like? And so if you want to do this now or later, maybe take a photo of this slide to save for later, but the survey is completely anonymous. It takes about 8 minutes or less to complete, and hopefully we'll get a good cross-section of people working in paleontology across the three locations. Now this talk was a bit of an introduction, I guess, and context on what we're actually doing. But if you would like to continue the conversation, next week on the 21st of May, Ryan and I are running a workshop. Oh, there's meant to be a QR code there, but just email us. And yeah, we want to see what you guys actually think. And it might be that you come to the workshop, we have a discussion, and then you do the survey, and you can put your thoughts then into the responses. But yeah, it would be great to have a further discussion to see what's next, what would be best, and would some of the things that occur in Australia and Canada work here? Why or why not? And lastly, if you want to know anything more about the Founder Fossil project more generally, you can find it at this QR code, but otherwise, thank you for having me, and if you have any questions, let me know.